Good morning. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak on this topic at this Quakers and Business Conference. My name is Stephen Allen, as I'll give you a little bit more background about me to start with. But in this presentation, it's going to last about 20 minutes. I'm going to first kind of outline, I suppose, why I'm looking and I suppose interested in researching Quakers and how they organise and thinking about aspects related to leadership and power, and then share with you some of the findings and some of the analysis from work that I've done over the past 6 years or so. So firstly, my background, I'm a lecturer at Sheffield University in the management school, and I suppose the reason why I decided to, I suppose, shift from other careers in and work in other jobs, private sector, various kind of organizational settings, was around this topic of sustainability. So thinking about the issue, this going back to when I started my PhD, late 2000s, so 2009 to 2012 was when I took my PhD, which was looking at particularly what do organizations do and don't do about environmental sustainability. So very much that's where my research is focused. I look particularly at what can we do about sustainability, what does that mean for organizations, and what does that mean in terms of leadership. And that's what's really taken me towards the thinking about the Quaker context and my connection with that, and thinking about this notion of kind of alternative organization, which I'll explain later, and how this is maybe more conducive or connected with these purposes around environmental sustainability and addressing challenges that we face. So to give a bit of context on the challenges around sustainability, I guess this is something that most of us will be quite aware of in different ways, maybe to different degrees, in terms of our kind of reading around the topic or listening to various debates, I suppose, associated with this. But in terms of sustainability, I suppose what where I'm sort of coming from, or where I'm coming into on this debate, is around thinking about, well, we've had this long history of evolution on the planet as we kind of understand different kind of periods of geological periods, and we're now entering what's suggested to be the Anthropocene. So this period of time where humans are seen to be regarded as the sort of the major sort of geological force on the planet in terms of altering its structure, its climate, and various aspects of it. And as we can see from the kind of the third image on this slide, in terms of the consequences of maybe that kind of the intensity in which humans are interacting with various kind of planetary processes being, I suppose, existing within the planet, is causing a whole range of questions about how do we understand these issues, and I suppose alarm bells in relation to aspects as ranging from nitrogen cycle, biodiversity, and also obviously so the climate change debates was possibly the most prominent. So there's a sort of moment that we're in here, that there is something kind of different that's occurring. There are changes within our habitat, as it were, that need to be looked at. There's something quite fundamentally different to this moment that we're in. Alongside that, and this sense of, I suppose, thinking about some of the kind of scientific studies of planetary change, environmental change, ecosystem changes, there's also what we're seeing is, I suppose, an increasing movement towards promoting agendas of doing something urgently about sustainability. So from the school climate strike to the sort of rise of social movements like Extinction Rebellion, the various kind of protests that's been associated with that. And so the sense that I'm kind of coming into this topic in terms of sustainability and thinking about it is, one, there's something new under the sun here, in the words of the kind of environmental historian John McNeill. This is a different moment, something different's happening here in terms of the human relationship with the planet, and thinking that requires some rapid and probably quite radical change in order to think about how we address these issues and our relationship and interactions with the world around us. So I spent quite a lot of time in my PhD talking to senior managers in the energy and power market. This was an area that I'd worked in previously, and it was quite interesting talking to them, both for their sense of some of the debates that were going on around climate change, very sort of complex understanding of the issues associated with those often, but also this sense of this kind of treadmill of kind of growth that we are on in terms of economic growth, and this being a sort of main driver for how they are kind of often instructed or required to think about their organizations. And I suppose through this and maybe their sort of articulated kind of powerlessness in doing things from the way in which their organizations are arranged, making changes, progressing on different aspects related to climate change. I suppose that has driven my interest in thinking, well, if there are these issues and problems for them within a sort of traditional, what might describe as a traditional organizational setting, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, then what are the alternatives? How do we reach for, in this moment, if there's something new under the sun, the requirements do things radically different, what are these alternatives, and what are the benefits and negative aspects associated with them? What can we learn from them? So when thinking about organising and sustainability, so I'm kind of giving you a bit of context there about why I'm into notions of sustainability. Then there's this connection with, I suppose, equality within organisations and more equal forms of organising. And various connections between social equality and ecological sustainability have been suggested, and there's some on this slide, whether this be about kind of intergenerational, gender aspects, racial inequalities, class, financial. These are all seen in their different ways, and I won't go into the detail here on the slide, but you can review that later or read it as I'm speaking now. There's a whole range of suggestions about how these might be interrelated, how different issues of social inequity produce social unsustainability. And certainly there's even literature, particularly around ideas of thinking, for example, about social ecology, which is an interesting area by particularly prominent author there is Murray Bookchin, that talks about the sort of domination of fellow humans is reflected in the origins of humans seeking dominion over kind of natural processes. That's quoted from him. So this idea that there are issues with domination, control, hierarchy, how these produce kind of potentially unequal relationships, and how those are making connections from the social and organizational inequities to environmental problems. Clearly these connections are at times difficult to fathom and pin down. However, I suppose this is where the assumptions are sort of coming from. And we could also look at, there's the book which many of us you might be aware of, the Wilkinson and Pickett's book on the spirit level, why more equal societies almost always do better, which again is making these connections, I suppose, between maybe not so much planetary health in some regards, but maybe more personal well-being of communities when they are more equal. So these are some of the connections to be made here. So as I say, this is what's led me towards spending time with sort of senior leaders in large private organisations. Some around the research I started with around my PhD around what was going on with environmental sustainability, and then moving that into the sphere of thinking, well, what are the alternatives if these environments create various issues within them, the patterns of organising, the various dimensions to it create issues, what are the alternatives? So alternative organisation is an area within management studies, might be more associated with what's called sort of critical management studies. So it describes forms of organising that aren't related to dimensions of sort of capitalist, so about capital accumulation, managerialists, i.e. the sense that there are expert managers who have the prerogative to make decisions, or that there's sort of hierarchies. So alternative organisations step out of what's described as a sort of traditional organisation, which is often kind of taken for granted form of organising, which is often unfortunately seen to be the way of organising in management and many management and business schools and business education. So within alternative organisation, which can help us reflect and think about what we might describe as traditional forms of organising. The suggestion here is that they both respect personal autonomy, but also have this framework for cooperation, and about sort of the idea that they're identified as alternative through this sense of taking responsibility to enable futures, sort of promise for individual flourishing, collective flourishing. These are the kind of ideas that relate to it, how they're identified. There also seem to be prefigurative in the sense, and this notion of prefiguration is about that they're not, I suppose, fully worked up alternative ways of organising society, as it were, but they are seen to be, I suppose, pathways or glimpses of what might be possible in terms of different ways of doing things, more equitable ways of organising social relationships, and getting things done together. Within alternative organisations, one of the tensions, and I guess maybe if we work in Quaker settings, maybe we can notice that ourselves, as I'll talk about Quakers as an alternative site of organisation, in terms of the sort of meeting structure and organisation, this tension between the freedom, individual's freedom, and acting collectively, and this is a sort of key dilemma that is associated with alternative organisations, this idea of people having freedom to make choices and move, but also the collective acting together, doing things together, and the tensions that those things cause. However, alternative organisations are then, I'm suggesting here, are potentially progressive ways of organising because they are reflective of these different equalities. So it's very much focused on ideas of different equalities, bringing that about through different ways of organising, more collective ways of organising, moving away from sort of assuming managerial structures and hierarchy to different ways of getting things done. So this is where my interest in Quaker organising comes, to explore Quakers as a site of alternative organising, and I'm sure as you're at this Quakers in Business conference that you will have an awareness of Quakers. Maybe that's varied. So I'm sure many of your understanding of the Quaker community is vastly beyond mine in terms of your involvement and awareness of different things that happen and go on. However, just to give a bit of background, so we've got so it's international community, and this idea of it being fitting an alternative organisation, I would say, because it respects personal autonomy, there's no creed or statement of belief, nobody is formally in charge via hierarchical roles. So here I'm thinking about particularly the local Quaker meeting arrangements, and the central idea of Quaker theology, God in everybody, and guiding by these four testimonies. So these aren't prescriptive in their way, so there's a sense that that's where we might understand personal autonomy to interpret and build that relationship in a sense with God and divine, these kind of ideas. In terms of cooperation and the framework for cooperation, the second dimension of alternative organisation, we can see this relates to the business method, in terms of how decisions are made, that kind of collective coming together, finding the will of the meeting or will of God to make come to a way forward. The specific role holders are kind of rotated and nominated. These are also part of, I suppose, understanding as a framework of cooperation. So that's how I'm kind of seeing and categorising Quakers as an alternative organisation. So my research spans, as I mentioned at the start, about 6 years. I've been involved with various Quaker meetings with my family in different ways over time, more intense involvement in some moments than others, and also in undertaking interviews with Quakers in the north of England, 20 Quakers in the north of England back in 2018, I think it was, and more recently I've spent half-day workshops around ideas of leadership and influence in Quakers with 8 meetings across the UK. So these are the things that I'm going to draw on to make some comments. We've got about another 5 minutes or so I'm just going to make some fairly brief comments about this work and what we might offer in terms of insights for progressive forms of organisation. In terms of Quaker leadership, leadership is a term that is often, I suppose, resisted within the Quaker context. It's typically can be, I mean, that there is variety, and I'll talk about that. But when it's connected to notions of heroic leadership, I suppose this kind of dominant idea of leadership, this kind of hero, savior, leader, or on the converse, the sort of more toxic leadership side, this sort of villain or evil kind of leader, where it's very much about the role and that person who's assuming a certain position of control via a hierarchy, typically. And this is seen to be something that is typically negative and associated more with traditional forms of organization. So leadership in alternative organizing in general, but also in the Quaker context, is a difficult relationship. And maybe, certainly from, I suppose, some of the things I'm going to share next, how leadership can be used effectively to determine Quakers it can be closely debated. Whether it's a productive term or not is maybe questionable. So when leadership or influence processes are seen to be positive within the Quaker setting, particularly about situations or moments where Quakers describe others as kind of opening up ways forward for decisions. So this sense that moments of leadership where people influence the process of coming together in order to bring out others' gifts, this kind of language, drawing people out. So the sense of leadership is not so much the sort of standing up and taking charge and being the heroic leader. This is very much something that can be seriously resisted within Quaker communities, both in terms of how they talk about it and I think how they operate, often in their decision making, and individuals that kind of assume those ways of being leader can be seen to be highly problematic. However, so it's very much about these processes, displaying as part of that, I suppose, also this sense of kind of knowledge and awareness, this idea of right ordering, which in some ways can be fairly ambiguous particularly to outsiders and often to insiders within Quaker communities. However, this idea that right ordering is about people coming together, discerning the will of God, doing that in particular ways around particularly the business method and the techniques associated with that. So it's seen again, not that somebody's imposing necessarily their understanding and knowledge or their awareness, and showing their awareness of Quaker text is something that comes out as related to them being kind of influential or showing leadership in particular moments. It's more about, again, this sort of process of bringing people together in order to kind of find that kind of collective understanding and will. When leadership, so that's more about, I suppose, moments and situations. The second aspect I'm just going to share briefly is about leadership, the influence, about a person. So this is more about connecting, I suppose, living their Quaker faith, how long they've been involved, the range of roles. But also there's a negative aspect, as I mentioned earlier, in the sense of people when in the Quaker setting, when they're kind of holding tightly views or trying to sort of be that more sort of heroic leader, I suppose, within the Quaker context, rather than what's seen more often as a sort of more favourable notion of leader. And in the paper that you can look at related to this work, to quite relational leadership as an idea, and develop that. So this is where leadership tends to fit, and maybe we can kind of draw some understanding from and thinking about how that might relate to other contexts. In terms of power, this is some work that I'm writing up at the moment. I'm just revising a chapter on this. Thinking about power in different ways. Again, it's not a term that's particularly embraced, and I don't have much time to really talk about it so much at the moment. Seeing my time is not so, there's not so much left. But power, I suppose, in terms of how typical views on power, as I kind of bring out in this chapter, which is developing and revising, in terms of how people own different types of power or power through structure. And I think often where power becomes an issue is where people are claiming possession over it within a Quaker context. So many of the kind of structures and processes are about not enabling people to hold and control power in terms of resources or materials or how things happen within the setting. But these are where it comes out. However, power by seeing somebody as kind of having a sort of personal sense of how they're able to articulate their views, and showing these comprehensive understandings in Quakers. These are forms of power that can be enacted, and people can understand those to be powerful in different moments. However, I think the more interesting dimensions may be moving away from that kind of power as possession idea, is more towards power and structure. So thinking about how the Quaker processes actually maybe unbundle in some ways different types of power, particularly around the way in which sort of the physical buildings are designed, the way in which sort of physical settings of meeting spaces, chairs in a circle, these kind of things. However, different roles and the ability to kind of, I suppose, set agendas, for example, related to clerk's role, and these kind of ideas do bring in different notions of power into it. However, as I said, I think the sort of some of the arrangements around what is seen to be in focus and out of focus through the physical kind of setting of the meeting house is interesting. I don't really have time to spend much on that, as I really need to go on to my final comments. So just some final reflections from this kind of fairly whirlwind quick tour of thinking about leadership and power as alternative form of organising in Quakers, as something that's responding more broadly to equality, linking into these sort of broader issues around ecological sustainability. I suppose the translation of leadership into the Quaker setting is embraced more when it is, I suppose, taking and giving leadership, this more fluid sense of leadership. So i.e. that there are moments when people have the opportunity to take leadership because of what they can bring within that moment. It's not sort of held attached to a particular body or a person. They are the leader. The being the leader fiction notion is what often becomes sort of, is found to be problematic for some Quakers, and I suppose that those kind of top-down hierarchical arrangements, whether it's work or other kind of religious communities that perhaps have more prevalence of those, or are less able to maybe think about and question those situations. This is probably people coming into Quakers who want to actually move away from those kind of hierarchical relationships, and so are particularly can at times be particularly troubled by any sort of forms of hierarchy such as that are more fixed to individuals. There are questions about, I suppose, in Quakers, this sort of fairly white middle class community, of how influence and leadership is distributed, how fluid it is, how we give, I suppose, leadership to others and take it from others, related to, I suppose, our performances of about how we contribute to discussions, how our bodies are read in relation to their influence or potential influence, how we might appear confident or otherwise. And there's a whole range of kind of complex issues here associated with how we read others' bodies to be influential or not influential. And the sense there is that there are these questions of, I suppose, invisible hierarchy, whilst the physical hierarchy we could talk as being removed with the role rotation, these various things. The chance that there's sort of these, because of different influence dynamics that can emerge and patterns between different people with different kind of orientations or focus or how they appear, can reproduce notions of hierarchy, not intentionally in many times, but can bring about different issues with them in terms of who is able to give and take in leadership, and that promotion of equality through the opportunity to contribute. Just finally, as I have certainly gone over time here, understand how we can create a power together. So I suppose it's this power with, I suppose, power over. This is something that comes through Quaker conversations, of finding ways that those patterns of working together can translate into other contexts outside of Quakers, other working contexts. And some Quakers talk about the potential for that translation and how they draw on ways of being within the Quaker setting and ways of working and doing minutes and these various things into other areas. However, others talk about them being such separate realms that they need to, if they want to get things done in either setting, they need to work entirely differently because of the different ways of working. And I guess this raises questions about different ways of working between, as I said, what we might describe as traditional and alternative. Okay, apologies that I've had to kind of rush through a bit there. I've gone over my time. It's been 25 minutes, but hopefully that's been useful. Thank you very much for listening.